There is something your soulmate has been trying to understand, and the strange part is that they didn't ask because they suddenly stopped caring. They asked because something inside them refused to let this connection remain unanswered. Recently, a question about the future of the two of you came up in their mind, and for a moment they actually allowed themselves to wonder where this story could go. Maybe they tried to act like they had already moved on. Maybe they convinced themselves that distance was the answer, that enough time would erase the confusion, the memories, and the feelings they never fully explained. But then, something happened that brought the connection back into focus. And this time, they didn't just think about you. They started wondering whether you are still part of the future they secretly imagine. Imagine standing at a crossroads after walking for so long that you almost forgot why you started the journey, only to suddenly recognize the road you once left behind. That is the kind of emotional moment they may be experiencing right now. They wanted clarity, but the answer they received didn't give them a simple yes or no. Instead, it opened another door, one they were not prepared to look through. And now they are questioning things they thought they had already settled inside themselves. Why does your name still carry so much weight? Why do certain memories return when they least expect them? Why does the idea of a future without you feel strangely incomplete? They may not have the courage to say these things out loud yet, but the question has already been planted. And once a person starts questioning whether they truly lost someone or simply walked away too soon, they cannot easily return to the certainty they had before. Because the answer didn't close this connection. It made them look at it again. But here is where the situation becomes much more confusing for your soulmate, because the answer they received did not give them the closure they were secretly hoping for. They may have asked a simple question about the future of this connection, expecting something definite, something that would allow them to finally put the uncertainty to rest. Maybe they wanted to hear that this chapter was over, so they could stop wondering. Maybe they expected confirmation that nothing could happen anymore, that enough time had passed, that the distance between you had become permanent. But instead, the answer left a strange possibility hanging in the air, and that possibility has been bothering them ever since. It wasn't a clear yes, and it wasn't a clear no. It was the kind of answer that makes you think about the question even more after the conversation is finished. And that is exactly what happened. They walked away with more questions than they had before. Suddenly, the future they thought they understood started looking completely different. They may have asked themselves, what if this connection isn't actually finished? Or what if there is still something unresolved between us? What if the distance wasn't the ending I thought it was? And the more they tried to dismiss those thoughts, the louder they seemed to become. Imagine standing in front of a locked door that you believed had been permanently closed, only to notice a small light underneath it. You don't know what is on the other side. You don't even know whether the door will ever open. But now you know one thing for certain. You cannot honestly pretend there is nothing behind it. That is the position your soulmate may find themselves in right now. They were trying to create certainty, but instead they received a reason to question everything they had already decided about you. And this is why their confusion is so important. They are not necessarily confused because they don't know whether they care. In some ways, they may be confused because they are beginning to realize that they care more deeply than they wanted to admit. Think about what happens when someone spends a long time repeating the same story to themselves. They tell themselves, it was just timing. It wasn't meant to happen. We were too different. They probably don't care anymore. I should move on. Eventually, those statements start feeling like facts. They become the explanation that makes everything easier to live with. But then one unexpected answer can shake that entire structure. Suddenly, the story they built around the connection no longer feels complete. And your soulmate may be experiencing exactly that kind of internal shift. They may be remembering moments they had deliberately pushed away. They may be thinking about conversations that ended too soon, things they wanted to say but never did, or moments when they could have handled everything differently. The strange thing about uncertainty is that it often makes the past louder. When the future suddenly becomes unclear, the mind goes backwards searching for clues. They start asking themselves whether they misunderstood your silence, whether they misread your distance, whether they assumed you had stopped caring when perhaps you were simply protecting yourself. And this is where the emotional tension becomes stronger, because they may have believed they were asking about the future, while the answer was quietly forcing them to examine the past. They wanted to know where this connection was going, but they were being pushed to understand why it became so complicated in the first place. You might be wondering, why would a simple answer affect them this much? Why would one conversation make them rethink something they had already tried to leave behind? Because sometimes people don't realize how emotionally attached they still are until something threatens the possibility of never experiencing the connection again. As long as they believed the future was already decided, they could keep their feelings under control. They could tell themselves that whatever happened between you belonged to another chapter. But uncertainty changes everything. When the door is completely closed, the mind eventually accepts the wall. But when the door is slightly open, even if nobody walks through it, curiosity survives. Imagine someone throwing away an old photograph because they believed they no longer needed it, only to find themselves searching through drawers months later because they suddenly want to see that face again. That isn't necessarily a decision to return. It is something more subtle. It is the realization that the emotional meaning of the connection never disappeared as completely as they believed. Your soulmate may be experiencing that realization now. They may not know what they want to do next, but they are no longer as certain about walking away as they once were. And there is another layer to this that you need to understand. Your soulmate may have expected the answer to give them control. Instead, it reminded them that some connections cannot be reduced to a simple decision made in one moment. They may have wanted to know whether they should wait, move on, reach out, or forget everything. But the answer may have forced them to sit with something much more uncomfortable. The future depends on choices that have not been made yet. That means nothing is completely settled. And when someone has been relying on certainty to protect themselves, that realization can feel overwhelming. They may begin watching for signs in ordinary moments. A song reminds them of you. A place brings back a memory. Someone says something that sounds strangely similar to something you once said. They see something that makes them wonder how you are doing. These moments don't necessarily prove anything supernatural, but emotionally they can become powerful reminders of a connection they thought they had placed behind them. And the more those reminders appear, the harder it becomes for them to maintain the belief that they are completely unaffected. This is why their behavior may seem contradictory. One moment they appear distant, and the next they seem deeply curious. One day they convince themselves they should let go, and another day they find themselves wondering what would happen if you crossed paths again. They may want answers, while simultaneously being afraid of what those answers could mean. They may want closeness but fear vulnerability. They may miss you but hesitate to admit it. They may imagine a future with you and then immediately tell themselves that it is impossible. That internal push and pull is exactly what makes the situation so emotionally intense. They are standing between what they told themselves and what they still feel. And when those two things stop matching, confusion becomes unavoidable. So if you have been wondering whether their silence means they no longer care, don't automatically assume that it does. Silence can mean many things, and in this situation, the more important question is what is happening beneath that silence. The answer they received appears to have disturbed a certainty they had built around this connection. They may now be realizing that they cannot simply label what happened between you and walk away emotionally untouched. They wanted an ending, but instead they received a question. They wanted certainty, but instead they received possibility. They wanted to know whether the future still had a place for this connection, and somehow the answer made them realize they still haven't completely decided what they want that future to look like. And this is where the story becomes even deeper, because once someone begins questioning the future, they inevitably start replaying the past. They start remembering the moments they ignored, the words they misunderstood, the opportunities they allowed to disappear, and the feelings they never fully expressed. Your soulmate may now be looking backward for the very reason they asked about tomorrow. Because before they can understand where this connection could go, they first have to confront what happened between you, and some of the memories waiting. For them, they may be much harder to face than they expected, and this is where your soulmate begins doing something they probably never expected to do again. They start replaying the past. Not casually, not like someone remembering an old relationship for a few seconds, but in a way that makes certain moments suddenly feel different. That answer about the future has created a question inside them, and now their mind is searching backward for clues. They may be remembering the conversations they once dismissed, the moments when you became distant, the things you said that they didn't fully understand at the time, and even the moments when they had an opportunity to be honest, but chose silence instead. Imagine watching an old movie for the second time and suddenly noticing details you completely missed the first time. The story hasn't changed. The scenes are exactly the same, but your understanding of them has changed. And suddenly, a moment that once seemed meaningless feels like it was pointing towards something much deeper. That may be happening inside your soulmate right now. They are looking at memories through a different emotional lens, and the more they look, the harder it becomes to convince themselves that everything between you was simply coincidence, timing, or a chapter that was supposed to disappear. There may be one particular moment they keep returning to. Maybe it was the last serious conversation you had. Maybe it was the moment you pulled away without explaining everything. Maybe it was a time when you looked at them differently and they didn't understand why. Or maybe it was something incredibly small, something they never thought they would remember, but now it keeps appearing in their mind at the strangest moments. They may be asking themselves, why did they say that? What were they really feeling? Why did I react that way? What if I had handled that moment differently? These questions are not random. They are what happens when someone realizes that their previous interpretation of a connection may have been incomplete. Your soulmate may have believed they understood why things unfolded the way they did, but now they are beginning to see another possibility. Maybe you weren't pulling away because you stopped caring. Maybe you were protecting yourself. Maybe you weren't silent because you had nothing to say. Maybe there were things you were waiting for them to understand without having to explain them. And that realization can be uncomfortable because it forces them to consider that some of the distance between you may not have been created by a lack of feeling. All this is where regret can quietly enter the picture. Not necessarily dramatic regret, not the kind that immediately leads someone to call you or confess everything. It can begin much more privately. They might lie awake thinking about what they should have said. They might remember a chance they had to make things right and wonder why they didn't take it. They might think about how easily they assumed you would always be there, only to realize that people don't remain emotionally available forever when they feel unseen or misunderstood. Imagine finding an old letter years later and realizing that one sentence inside it explains everything you were too distracted to understand when you first read it. You can't change the words. You can't return to that exact moment. All you can do is finally understand what they meant. That is the kind of realization your soulmate may be moving through. They are not simply remembering you. They are reconsidering you, and perhaps the most confusing part for them is that these memories don't only bring sadness. Some of them may bring warmth, comfort, or even a strange sense of peace. They may remember how natural it felt to talk to you, how easily you understood things they struggled to explain to other people, how certain moments with you felt different from everything else. They may remember your energy, your presence, your way of responding when they were vulnerable. Maybe there was something about the connection that made them feel seen, even when they weren't ready to admit how much that mattered. At the time, they may have taken those moments for granted because they assumed there would always be another opportunity. Now the future feels uncertain, and suddenly those memories carry a completely different weight. They may be realizing that what they once considered ordinary was actually something they haven't been able to recreate. You might be wondering why someone would only recognize these things now. Why couldn't they understand them when you were actually there? Because people often understand value differently after distance creates perspective. When something is constantly available, the mind can become comfortable with it. When it becomes distant, the mind starts noticing the space it left behind. Your soulmate may now be noticing that certain conversations don't feel the same with other people. Certain connections don't carry the same emotional depth. Certain memories don't disappear just because time passes. And that doesn't automatically mean they are ready to return, but it does mean something inside them has changed. They can no longer rely on the old explanation as easily as before. The answer they received about the future may have opened this entire emotional door. Before that moment, they could keep looking forward and telling themselves that everything was already decided. But now, every time they think about tomorrow, the past seems to appear beside it. They are beginning to understand that the future cannot be separated from what happened between you. If they want to know whether this connection has another chapter, they first have to acknowledge why the previous chapter ended the way it did. And that means facing their own choices, their own fears, their own hesitation, and perhaps the ways they contributed to the distance. So if you have been feeling that something has shifted, even though nothing obvious has happened, understand that some changes begin internally long before they become visible externally. Your soulmate may not be speaking yet. They may not be reaching out yet. They may still be confused about what to do. But the question they asked about the future has already forced them to look backward, and what they are finding there may be impossible to ignore. They are realizing that the story they told themselves about you may not be the whole story. And once someone begins questioning the version of the past they used to protect themselves, they eventually have to face the choice they have been avoiding all along, whether to continue hiding behind uncertainty or finally become honest about what this connection still means to them. And now we reach the point your soulmate can no longer avoid, because understanding the past is only the beginning. The real question is what they are going to do with everything they have suddenly realized. For a while, they may have believed that time would make the decision for them. They thought distance would eventually tell them whether to let go or hold on. They thought if they stayed quiet long enough, the feelings would become easier to understand. But now they are realizing that time doesn't always make a decision for you. Sometimes it simply makes the truth harder to ignore. And that is exactly where they may be standing right now. They asked about the future of this connection because some part of them wanted certainty. But what they received forced them to recognize something much more uncomfortable. The future cannot be separated from the choices they make now. They may have spent months wondering whether you would come back, whether you still care, whether you would ever open that door again. But suddenly they are beginning to understand that waiting for you to make everything clear may not work anymore. At some point, they have to decide what they actually want. This is where their internal battle becomes stronger. One part of them wants to protect everything they have built since the connection became distant. They may tell themselves that staying silent is safer. They may think reaching out would expose feelings they have spent a long time controlling. They may worry that you have changed, that you no longer feel the same, or that they waited too long. But another part of them keeps asking a much harder question. What if staying silent becomes the biggest regret of their life? What if the opportunity they are afraid to take is the very opportunity they will wish they had taken later? Imagine standing outside a door you've wanted to open for a long time, with your hand almost touching the handle, but realizing that opening it means admitting you were afraid to knock. That is what vulnerability feels like. It isn't the absence of fear. It is deciding that the truth matters more than protecting yourself from the possibility of rejection. Your soulmate may also be realizing that this connection cannot be repaired through imagination alone. They can think about you every night. They can replay memories. They can wonder what you are doing, what you feel, or whether you still remember them. But eventually, thoughts have to become choices. This is why their confusion may feel so intense right now. They are caught between emotion and action. They may know what their heart wants, while still being uncertain about what they are willing to risk. And that difference matters, because wanting someone privately is easy. Admitting that you still want them when the possibility of rejection exists is much harder. They may be asking themselves, if I reach out, what happens next? Or what if they don't respond the way I hope? What if they have already moved on? What if I finally tell them the truth and everything changes? These questions can keep someone frozen even when their feelings are becoming clearer. But there is another possibility they are beginning to consider, and this one may be even more powerful. What if you are not waiting for them anymore? What if the version of you they remember, the person who was always available, always understanding, always willing to give another chance, is no longer standing in the same place? They may be starting to sense that your silence has changed meaning. Before, they may have interpreted it as distance that would eventually disappear. Now they may be wondering if your silence is actually acceptance. Acceptance that whatever happens next cannot be forced. Acceptance that you cannot keep carrying a connection by yourself. And that realization can create urgency. Because when someone realizes that the other person may genuinely continue their life without them, the future suddenly becomes much more real. Imagine a train sitting at a station with the doors open. Someone has spent too long standing on the platform, trying to decide whether to get on. They keep telling themselves there will be another train. Maybe there will be, but when the doors begin to close, the hesitation suddenly feels different. The choice becomes real. Your soulmate may be approaching a similar emotional moment. They are realizing that feelings alone don't preserve connections. Timing, honesty, courage, communication, and mutual effort matter too. And perhaps that is what the answer they received was really forcing them to understand. The future is not simply something waiting to happen to them. It is something their choices can influence. This doesn't mean you should chase them, send messages to force an answer, or try to make something happen before it is ready. In fact, the strongest part of this situation may be that you don't need to do anything at all. Let them confront their own feelings. Let them understand what they lost, what they misunderstood, and what they actually want. If they truly want another chapter, their actions eventually need to communicate that. Words can create hope, but consistent actions create trust. And your soulmate may finally be beginning to understand that the future they asked about cannot be built on old patterns. If there is another chapter, something has to change. That is why the answer left them so confused. It didn't simply tell them whether you and they have a future. It forced them to realize that they have a responsibility in determining what happens next. They can continue protecting themselves, or they can become honest. They can keep pretending the connection doesn't matter, or they can acknowledge why the thought of losing it permanently bothers them. They can remain trapped inside the past, or they can finally learn from it. And somewhere beneath all that confusion is a realization they may not be ready to say out loud yet. They are no longer asking only whether you belong in their future. They are asking whether they are brave enough to do something about the feelings that still exist. And once that question becomes impossible to ignore, the entire meaning of this connection begins to change. And now, after everything your soulmate has been thinking about, remembering and questioning, they are reaching the realization that may be the hardest one of all. This connection still occupies a place inside their heart that they never fully managed to remove. They asked about the future because they wanted to know whether there was still a possibility. But the deeper truth is that they may have already been carrying that possibility quietly within themselves. They may have tried to convince themselves that they were finished with the past, that enough time had passed, that the distance between you had become permanent. But now they are discovering something uncomfortable. You can move away from someone physically and still carry them emotionally. You can stop talking to someone and still wonder what they would say. You can build a completely different routine and still have one person appear in your thoughts when you least expect it. And perhaps that is why the answer affected them so deeply. It didn't simply give them information about the future. It touched something they had been trying not to feel. Imagine closing a book and placing it on a shelf because you believe the story is finished, only to pick it up months later and realize you never actually read the final page. That is what this connection may feel like to them now. They thought the story had ended, but somewhere inside, they still feel like something remains unresolved. They may now be questioning whether what they called moving on was actually moving forward, or simply learning how to live without addressing what they still felt. There is a difference. Moving forward brings acceptance. Avoidance simply creates distance. And your soulmate may be realizing that they spent a long time confusing the two. They may have kept themselves busy, focused on other things, met new people, changed their priorities, or simply stopped talking about you. From the outside, it may have looked like they had completely let go, but internally, certain memories remained untouched. And when the question about the future appeared, those memories suddenly became relevant again. They may have realized that whenever they imagined the future, some part of them still wondered where you would be in it. Not necessarily because they consciously planned everything around you, but because your presence had become connected to a version of life they once imagined. That realization can be deeply confusing because it forces them to confront the possibility that their feelings were never as temporary as they wanted them to be. You might be wondering, does this mean they are definitely coming back? Not necessarily. And this is where you need to understand the difference between an emotional realization and an actual decision. Someone can miss you and still be afraid. Someone can love you and still struggle to communicate. Someone can imagine a future and still hesitate to take the first step. Feelings are powerful, but actions are what eventually reveal intention. Your soulmate may be standing at that exact emotional threshold right now. They are beginning to understand what they feel, but they are still figuring out what they are willing to do about it. And perhaps that is why the answer they received left them so confused. If they had been told there was absolutely no future, they could have forced themselves to accept it. If they had been told everything would immediately work out, they could have relaxed. But instead, they were left somewhere in between certainty and possibility. And that space has forced them to confront themselves. They may be realizing that if there is another chapter between you, it cannot look exactly like the old one. Something has to change. The communication has to become more honest. The fear has to become less powerful. The misunderstandings have to be addressed instead of ignored. The connection cannot survive on memories alone. It needs two people who are willing to show up differently than they did before. And that may be the most important realization your soulmate has received from this entire experience. The future isn't about recreating the past. It is about understanding the past well enough to avoid repeating it. They may finally be seeing that what happened between you wasn't necessarily proof that the connection was wrong. It may have revealed the areas where both people were not ready, not honest, not emotionally prepared, or simply unable to meet each other at the right moment. And there is something else they may be realizing about you. They may have underestimated how deeply you were affected by everything that happened. Perhaps they assumed your silence meant you didn't care. Perhaps they believed that because you stopped explaining yourself, you had stopped feeling. But now, they may be wondering whether your silence was actually the result of caring too much and realizing you could no longer keep carrying the emotional weight alone. That realization can change the way they remember you. Suddenly, your distance doesn't look as cold. Your silence doesn't look as empty. Your absence doesn't feel like proof that the connection meant nothing. Instead, they may begin seeing your absence as evidence that something inside you changed. And that can make them wonder whether they still have a place in your world. Imagine standing on opposite sides of a river after spending years believing the distance between you was permanent. Then one day you notice a bridge being built. You don't know who is building it. You don't know whether either person will cross it. But suddenly, the river no longer feels like an ending. It becomes a distance that could potentially be crossed if both people choose to walk toward each other. That is the energy surrounding this connection now. The future isn't guaranteed, but it is no longer something your soulmate can dismiss without thinking. They have been forced to acknowledge the possibility, and once someone acknowledges a possibility that touches their heart, it becomes much harder to pretend it doesn't exist. So perhaps the real answer they received wasn't a specific date, a guaranteed reunion, or a simple prediction about what happens next. Perhaps the real answer was something much more unsettling, that the story between you is not something they can understand by looking only at what happened before. They have to look at who you both are now. They have to look at what has changed. They have to look at what they still feel. And most importantly, they have to decide whether they are willing to approach this connection with honesty instead of fear. Because you should not have to chase someone into clarity. You should not have to convince someone of your value. You should not have to force a future that requires mutual choice. If another chapter is meant to happen, it needs to be created through real effort, honest communication, and actions that match the feelings. And maybe that is why this entire situation feels so different now. Your soulmate asked about the future, expecting an answer that would help them move on or move forward. Instead, the answer made them look directly at the one thing they were trying to avoid. They still don't know how to completely imagine their future without wondering where you fit into it. They may not know what happens next. They may still be afraid. They may still need time. But the question has been asked, the past has been reopened, and the certainty they once depended on has disappeared. Now they have something far more powerful to confront, the possibility that the connection they thought they had left behind may still have a chapter they haven't been brave enough to read.